The sky was dark with no stars and no moon, and the cold wind moved through the empty fields, like a whisper that wanted to speak, but no one listened, and the sound of footsteps on the dirt road was the only thing alive in the silence, as the alien girl walked slowly with her small child, held tight in her arms, and her body shaking from the cold, and from fear, and from hunger that had not left her for 2 days and 3 nights. Her name was Leia, and she had once lived in a strong clan, with bright lights and strong walls and rules that no one was allowed to break, but she had broken one without meaning to, and now she had nothing but the small blanket around her child and her feet that hurt more with every step, and a road that led to a land she did not understand. Her child's name was Corin, and he was only half of her kind, and his blood was not pure, and the elders said he was a danger to the clan and to the peace they claimed to love, and so they had shouted and pointed and pushed her away, and said she could not return ever again, and if she did, they would end her life, and her child's life too. Corin cried softly as she walked, and she tried to hum a sound that her mother used to sing when she was small, but the song was old and broken, and her lips were too dry to sing, and her voice was too tired to carry the words. And so she just kept walking, and hoped there would be a place to rest, before the next cold wind stole the last of her strength ahead. She saw lights in the distance, not bright, and not many, but enough to make her stop and hold her breath and wonder if it was safe, or if she should turn back, even though there was nothing behind her but the dark and the pain and the faces of her people who now hated her for loving her child more than their laws. She walked closer, and saw a house made of old wood and stone, and smoke came from a small pipe on the roof, and it smelled like fire and food and safety, and it made her legs weak with hope and fear at the same time, and she stepped onto the porch and raised her hand to knock on the door, but her fingers shook so hard that she had to use her other hand to help, and then the sound echoed into the night. There was silence, and then footsteps slow and heavy like someone old and strong but not in a rush, and the door opened with a soft creak, and the light spilled out, and it made her eyes hurt and blink, and then she saw him standing there with a long coat and a tired face, and a metal stick in his hands that pointed near her chest but not at her head. He was human, and his skin was lined with years, and sun and wind, and his eyes were not kind, but not cruel either, and he looked at her, and then at the child, and then back at her, and she said nothing, because she had no words left, and her voice had no strength, and her heart was too full of fear and shame and cold. The human looked at her for a long time, and the wind howled again, and Corin let out a soft sob that made her hold him tighter and lower her head, because she thought this was the end, and no one would help her, not even the beings who called themselves kind and free and open and strong. But then the man moved the metal stick away, and stepped back and nodded once, and said one word only, and that word was enough to make her knees give out, and her chest tighten, and her arms shake as she fell forward, just enough to catch the edge of the door before she dropped. The word was come. She stepped inside, and the warmth hit her skin like soft fire, and she could smell old wood and dry herbs, and a kind of soup that made her mouth water, even though her stomach felt too empty to eat, and she looked around slowly, ready for a trap or a trick or a cruel joke, because she had learned that hope was dangerous, and kindness was often a lie. The man said nothing else as he closed the door, and placed the metal stick on the wall, and moved to the fireplace, where he stirred the pot, and added something from a jar, and then he walked to a chair, and sat down. Without looking at her again, she stood there near the door, still holding Corin, who had fallen asleep against her chest. And she did not know what to do next, or what to say, or even how to thank him, and so she did nothing except watch him as he sat in the chair and stared into the fire, like he was lost in a memory that had no end. Outside the wind kept blowing, but inside the room it was warm and quiet, and for the first time in many days, Willia did not feel like she was about to die. She only felt confused and scared and tired and safe all at once, and she had no idea why the old human farmer had helped her, or what he wanted, or how long he would let them stay, but she knew one thing for sure: this night was not the end, it might be the beginning. The room was still, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire, and the slow steady breathing of the old man as he sat in his chair, while the alien girl stood near the door, with her child still wrapped close to her chest, afraid to move, and afraid to stay, but too tired to decide which fear mattered more. The man did not speak, and he did not look at her again, as he stirred the soup with careful hands, and poured some into a wooden bowl, and placed it on the table before going back to his chair. Like this was something he did every night for someone who never showed up, and now she was here, and he still said nothing. She looked at the bowl, then at the man, then back at her child, who had started to whimper again, and she stepped forward slowly, her legs weak and unsure, and her mind still screaming that this could be a trap, and humans had never been kind to her. Kind, not really, not deep down, but she needed food, and she needed warmth, and her child needed more than just love. So she sat at the table and tasted the soup, and the heat rushed through her mouth and down her throat, and her eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from the memory of taste. From the feeling of being fed, instead of chased. The man watched her from the corner of his eye, but said nothing. And when she finished, he stood again, and brought a folded blanket from the shelf, and pointed to the corner of the room, where an old couch sat under a window with curtains made from patched cloth. She carried her child to the couch, and laid him down gently, and sat beside him, not daring to sleep, not ready to close her eyes, and trust this strange quiet place, with its strange quiet owner, who moved like someone who had seen too much, and lost even more. The night passed slow and quiet, and the wind outside howled like a lost voice, calling through the hills, but the fire stayed alive, and the room stayed warm, and for a little, while she did not think about the ones who had turned their backs on her, or the elders who called her child cursed, or the friend who had promised to help, and then walked away, she watched the old man sleep in his chair, his hand resting near the old metal stick on the wall, and she wondered what he had done before this life of silence and farming, and why he had let her in when no one else would even look at her without hate. When morning came, the light crept through the curtains like gold dust, and she rose before the man moved and stepped outside just for a moment, just to breathe the new day and see where she had landed. And the farm stretched wide, with open fields and broken machines, and a fence that ran far into the distance. She saw no other homes, no other roads, just sky and wind and soil, and the scent of old earth rising from the ground, like it had been waiting for something to grow again. Inside, the man was awake and making more soup, and this time he placed 2 bowls on the table and looked at her for the first time with eyes that held no hate, no fear, just something old and heavy and still alive. He asked her name, and she said Rayla, and then he asked the name of the child, and she said Corin, and he nodded once and said his name was Thomas, and that was all. No questions, no judgments. Just names like simple facts, shared between people who had nothing left to hide. Later that day, she tried to help in the yard, but he waved her off and told her to rest, and so she sat with her child in the sun, and listened to the birds and the wind and the soft hum of something deep in the soil, like the earth was trying to speak, but not ready yet. That night, as they ate again, and the fire danced again, and Corin laughed for the first time in days, she thought maybe this place was not just shelter, but something more, something like a chance to start again. But just as that thought touched her mind, she heard a sound outside, not the wind, not the animals, not something natural, but footsteps, slow and soft, moving through the field and toward the house. She stood quickly and held Corin tight and looked at Thomas, who had already stood, and picked up his old metal stick and walked to the door. Without fear, she followed him to the window and looked out and saw a figure in the dark, tall and thin, and not human, with armor that glowed faintly in the night, and eyes that burned like coals. Thomas opened the door and stepped out into the night, and Rayla held her breath as the figure raised one hand, not in peace but in warning. He spoke in her native tongue and said, "You have taken in the cast out, you have invited the curse. You have claimed what does not belong to your kind." Thomas said nothing. He just raised his metal stick and pointed it at the sky, then slowly lowered it back to the ground and stared at the figure until it stepped back and vanished into the dark without a word. Leia turned to Thomas, her voice shaking, and asked, "Why did you do that?" He looked at her and said, "You are not the first I have helped." And then he walked back inside without another word, and the night grew colder, but the fire inside still burned strong. The sky was heavy and low, and gray clouds moved like slow beasts across the land, while the farm stood quiet and still, with only the smoke from the chimney rising into the cold air. And inside the old house, Leia sat by the fire holding her son close, while her eyes stayed fixed on the man who had saved her more than once, without asking anything in return. Thomas sat at the table with a cloth over his lap, cleaning the old metal stick with slow, careful hands, while the steam from the soup pot rose around him like morning fog, and his face was calm, but his eyes held something old and sharp, like stone, that had been shaped by many storms. She wanted to ask more about what he had said the night before, but the words stayed trapped in her throat because something in his silence made her feel like the answer would be too heavy to carry. Corin played on the floor with a piece of cloth tied into a ball, laughing softly in a way that made her chest ache with both joy and worry, because she knew peace never stayed long, not for her, not for her kind. The door creaked and she turned fast, but it was only the wind pushing against it, with no real strength. And she let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, and looked at Thomas, who gave the door a quick glance, and then kept cleaning like he had done this before, too many times to be afraid anymore. Later that day, Thomas showed her how to stack the wood near the stove, and how to feed the hens, and how to carry water from the pump without spilling, and she listened and learned, because even though she did not know how long they would stay, She wanted to be useful. She wanted to earn the space they took in the evening. As the sky turned from gray to deep blue, she saw movement again in the far field, near the edge of the trees, and this time it was not the wind or a wild animal, but a figure standing still, like a shadow that had forgotten how to move. She grabbed Corin and backed toward the house, her heart pounding and her breath quick and sharp, and Thomas looked out the window and did not speak, but reached for the metal stick and walked outside without a word. She followed to the doorway, but did not step out, and watched him cross the field with slow, steady steps, while the figure stood waiting, tall and wrapped in dark robes, with eyes that glowed soft red like embers under ash. The two stood facing each other for a long time, with no words passing between them, and then the figure raised a hand and pointed toward the house, and a voice came from the air, not loud but deep and clear and filled with warning. "You are harboring the cast out," the voice said, "and you are now marked by her stain, and her child's blood will bring danger to all who protect him." Thomas did not move and did not blink, and his voice, when it came, was quiet but strong and firm, like the sound of stone falling into water. "They are safe here," he said, "and they stay as long as they wish, and I have seen more danger from those who hunt mothers than from any child born of love." The figure stood silent for a long moment, and then spoke again with ice in its tone. "Then you will share their fate." Thomas only said, "Then so be it," and raised the metal stick and aimed it at the sky, and fired a bright flare that lit the clouds for a second, and vanished like lightning. Swallowed by darkness, the figure stepped back once, then turned and faded into the trees without another word, and the field grew quiet again, but the air felt heavier, and the cold felt deeper, and Leia stood frozen in the doorway, not knowing whether to cry or run, or fall to her knees and beg this old man to tell her why he had risked everything when he returned. She asked him with a voice that shook like the firelight on the wall, and he sat down without speaking, and placed the metal stick on the table, and looked into the flames, like they held the face of someone he had lost long ago. He said, "I once fought in the great war between stars, and saw too many things that should not exist, and heard too many screams from voices that did not survive, and I made a promise once to protect those no one else would." Leia said, "But you do not even know me," and he said, "I know enough, and sometimes enough is all that matters." She wanted to thank him, but the words felt too small and too soft for what he had done, and so she just nodded and sat beside him and placed Corin in his lap, and the old man held the child without fear, and the boy laughed and reached up to touch his beard outside the wind. Picked up again, and the stars tried to shine through the clouds, and the field where the stranger had stood was empty now, but the memory of the warning still hung in the air like smoke that would not fade inside the house, though the fire still burned and the warmth stayed strong, and for the first time, Leia began to believe that maybe this place could be more than a stop on the road. Maybe it could be the start of something they had never been allowed to dream about before, something like peace, something like home. The sun rose slowly behind the hills, casting long shadows over the field, while thin mist curled around the trees like quiet fingers, holding secrets. And inside the house, Leia sat at the window watching the light break through the dark, and wondering what would come next. Now that a warning had been given, and a line had been crossed, Thomas moved around the kitchen, with the same slow care he always showed, boiling water, slicing vegetables, feeding the stove, without hurry, and without words, and she watched him with questions in her heart, questions that had grown louder since the night he had faced the stranger without fear. After breakfast, she followed him outside, where he worked on an old machine that had not run for many seasons, and though her hands were not made for such tools, she offered help, and he nodded once and gave her a wrench and pointed to a bolt. And for a while, they worked in silence, with only the sound of birds and turning metal, and her son's laughter in the grass nearby. Later, she sat beside him, under the old tree near the fence, where wildflowers grew between the cracks, and asked him what he meant when he said they were not the first, and this time he did not turn away or change the subject, but looked into the distance like the story he carried lived far away, and needed to be called back. He said, "Once I wore a uniform, and flew in a ship, and carried orders from a voice I never met, and I thought I was doing good because they told me I was, and the stars were full of war, and my hands were full of weapons, and we dropped fire on cities that looked like silver and glass, and I watched them melt into nothing." He said, "I followed those orders until I met a child like yours, small, afraid, and hiding in the ruins of her world, and I should have left her or turned her in. But I didn't, and I took her with me, and I ran from my post, and they called me a traitor and a fool, and I lost my rank and my home and everything I thought I was fighting for." He said, "I brought her here to this planet, to this house, and I raised her like she was mine, and for a while we were happy, and the war never found us, and the wind in the trees was enough," and she laughed. Like the sky was always blue, but peace does not last when the past is not buried. And one night, they came for her, not soldiers, not her kind, but men with fear in their hearts and fire in their hands, and they took her from me, and burned part of this house, and left me with her name and her memory, and a silence I have lived with every day since our Leia sat still as the wind moved through the grass, and the sun warmed her face, and she looked at Thomas, not as a stranger or a human or a farmer, but as someone who knew pain as deep as hers, and maybe deeper because he had chosen love and lost it, while she had only begun to hope. She said, "I am sorry." And he said, "Do not be sorry for surviving, and do not be sorry for loving your child, and if I can give you even one safe day, then that is more than most get in a life like this." That evening, as the sky turned orange and gold, she cooked for him. For the first time using herbs she found near the fence and roots from the field. And the taste was strange, but warm, and he smiled for the first time since she had arrived, and Corin clapped and laughed with soup on his chin, and the sound filled the house like sunlight through broken clouds. But later, when the fire burned low and Thomas sat in his chair cleaning the same old metal stick, she heard a noise from outside. Like a hum, like an engine, like something moving through the sky that should not be there. She stepped to the window and saw a faint red light in the clouds, moving fast and low, and then gone like a ghost, and she looked at Thomas, who had gone still with the cloth in his hand, and a shadow in his eyes. He stood and walked to the back room, and came out with a small black box that blinked once, and then again, and she asked what it was, and he said it was a beacon, and someone had activated it near the house, which meant they were no longer just being watched. They were being hunted. He said, "I need to hide you." And the boy, and she said, "Where?" And he opened a door she had not seen before, hidden behind the woodpile, and led her down old stone steps to a room under the ground, where the air was cool and the walls were thick, and lined with old supplies and maps and blankets. He gave her a small device, and said, "If I do not return, press this and run east to the river." And she said, "I will not leave you." And he said, "If you stay, he will lose you, and I will lose him, and none of us will win." She held his hand for a long moment, then let go, and took Corin into her arms, and watched as the door closed above her, and the light faded into dark, and her heart beat loud in the silence, as the hum returned in. The sky above and the war she had escaped came knocking on the door of the only home she had left. The sky was full of red, and the low sound of engines echoed across the field like thunder, trapped in metal, while the farmhouse stood quiet but not asleep, and under the earth Leia held her child close as the air grew colder, and the silence grew deeper with each passing minute. Thomas stood at the edge of the field, his eyes fixed on the dark shape that hovered above the trees like a bird made of fire and steel, and he knew this was not a scout and not a warning, but something final, something sent to finish what others had failed to do. The ship landed without noise, and the grass bent under its weight, and the wind stopped moving as the hatch opened, and 4 figures stepped out wearing the armor of the High Clan, and holding weapons that glowed with soft blue light, and none of them spoke as they walked toward the house. Thomas waited near the barn with the old metal stick in one hand, and a small device in the other, and his breath was steady and slow, like a man who had done this before, and had already decided what price he was willing to pay. The leader of the group stopped a few feet away, and raised one hand, and spoke in the human tongue, with a voice that held no feeling, and no doubt, and said, "We know she is here, we know the child lives, and we are here to take them both." Thomas said, "This is my land, and I do not give shelter to thieves and killers." And the leader said, "We are law, not thieves, and we are justice, not killers, and she is a danger, and a child is a curse, and your protection means nothing to us." Thomas said, "Maybe not to you, but it means something to me." And the leader stepped forward, and raised his weapon, and said, "Then you will fall with them." And Thomas pressed the device in his hand, and the barn behind him exploded in a wall of fire and smoke, and the blast knocked the soldiers back, and lit up the night like a second sun. Leia heard the explosion through the stone, and pressed Corin close, as dust rained down from the ceiling, and the sound of metal and fire filled her ears, and her heart screamed louder than her voice ever could, and she wanted to run up the steps and find him, but she remembered his words, and she stayed still with tears running down her face. Like rivers through stone above the ground, Thomas moved through the smoke, like a shadow from the past, and used every trick he had learned from the war, and every trap he had buried in the field, and the soldiers fell one by one, confused and blind, in the fire and the dust. And when only the leader remained, he dropped his weapon, and faced Thomas with empty hands and burning eyes. "You think this is over," the leader said, "but there are more, and they will come, and they will not stop, and your house will be ashes, and your name will be dust, and the blood you protect will drown this world." And Thomas said, "Then let them come." And he struck the leader with the butt of his weapon, and watched him fall like a tree in winter when the flames died down. and the ship was nothing but a skeleton of smoke and heat. Thomas fell to his knees and felt the pain in his side, where the fire had touched him, and his hand was shaking as he pressed against the wound, and tried to stay awake just long enough to reach the door and open the way to the cellar. Heard the door open and climbed up fast with Corin in her arms, and she found him there, half in the light, half in the dark, and she dropped beside him and cried his name, and he smiled through blood and dust and said, "I told you not to come up." And she said, "I could not let you die alone." And he laughed, soft and broken, and said, "Stubborn like her." And she did not ask who he meant, because she knew. She pulled him inside and cleaned the wound with shaking hands, and tore cloth from her robe to wrap it, and sat beside him through the night, feeding him water and soup, and whispering stories from her childhood, while Corin slept at his feet, with a hand on his boot, like it was the safest thing in the world. Outside, the ship burned until morning, and no more shadows came from the trees, and no more voices spoke in the wind, and the sky turned gold again, and the birds returned, and the silence became peace, not fear. Thomas opened his eyes, and saw her there, and said, "You should run now, while the path is clear." And she said, "We stay together, or not at all." And he closed his eyes again with a smile, and said, "Then, you are part of this land now, and no storm can move you, and no law can take you." She did not know what would come next, but she knew the fire had passed, and the earth still held them, and the house still stood, and the man who had risked everything still breathed, and her child still dreamed, and for now that was enough to keep going, one step, one breath, one hope at a time. The wind carried ash across the field, as smoke curled from the broken metal of the ruined ship, and the ground was black in places where the fire had eaten through the soil, but the house still stood, and the fence still lined the edge of the land, like old bones holding back the storm. And inside the house, Thomas rested on the couch, with bandages around his side, and a blanket pulled up to his chest, while Relea moved quietly from room to room, watching the sky with eyes full of fear and fire. Corin played near the fireplace, with small stones and bits of thread tied together to look like flying beasts, and his laughter filled the space with a sound that made her heart ache, because it was too pure for a world that kept trying to tear it apart. And she knew that silence would return soon, and that peace never stayed long for those who ran from power and punishment. She walked outside just as the sun dipped below the trees, and the sky turned gold and purple, and saw the trails in the sky like fingers reaching down from the clouds, and she knew the first wave had been scouts, and the second had been hunters. But what came now would be soldiers, who followed no rules, and left no one behind. She stepped back into the house, and locked every door and window, and pulled the shades tight, and when Thomas opened his eyes, she told him what she saw, and he nodded once without fear, and sat up with a quiet groan, and reached for the metal stick that still lay beside him like a trusted friend who had never broken a promise. They worked together as the stars came out, setting traps near the barn, and hiding beacons in the well, and placing small bursts under the soil near the tree line. And she moved with speed and skill, while he guided her with words from his old life as a soldier, and she followed them because she trusted him more than she trusted the police. Corin watched them with wide eyes, and did not cry, and did not complain. And when Waylea kissed his forehead, and told him to stay in the cellar and be brave, he nodded and said, "I will be brave like him," and pointed to Thomas, who gave him a wink, and said, "Protect your mother, little warrior." And the boy saluted with a grin that nearly broke her heart. The night grew cold as the wind picked up, and the trees swayed like they knew what was coming, and the air smelled like metal, and rain, and something sharp that made the skin crawl, and the stars above blinked, as if unsure whether to shine or hide. They took positions behind the broken tractor, and near the water barrels, and waited, without speaking, and the silence stretched like a thread pulled too tight, and then snapped as lights appeared over the hill, and shadows moved across the ground, with no sound but purpose in every step. 5 soldiers in dark armor came down the road with weapons in hand, and eyes that glowed like fire under glass, and they did not stop or slow or speak as they passed the fence and stepped into the yard and looked straight at the house like it was already theirs. Thomas aimed first, and the burst hit the lead soldier in the chest, and sent him flying into the wall of the barn, with a crack that shook the window panes, and then the ground exploded near the second and third, as they stepped on the buried bursts, and were thrown into the night like dolls without strings. The fourth turned toward Thomas, and fired, but the shot missed, and hit the tree instead, sending bark flying, and Relea moved fast and silent from the side and launched her own strike with a shard of metal she had shaped into a blade, and it cut deep into the armor at the neck, where the plates did not meet. The 5th soldier raised a hand, and called for backup, and a signal lit the sky like a red wound, and Thomas shouted to Relea to fall back, and she ran with him toward the house, just as another ship appeared. low and wide and full of light and noise that hurt the ears and made Corin scream from below. They reached the cellar just as the new soldiers began to drop from the ship like metal rain, and Thomas looked at Weya and said, "We hold here." And she nodded with tears in her eyes and said together, and they stood before the cellar door as the ground shook and the night roared. The house above them shook with every step of the soldiers and then fell silent, and Thomas whispered, "Hold your breath," and the world exploded again as the main charge in the stove went off and took half the floor with it, and fire spread through the walls like a beast. Set free smoke filled the air, but the cellar was strong and deep, and the door held fast, and when the fire died and the ash settled, there were no more steps and no more lights and no more sounds of machines or voices. Just the slow return of wind and the song of distant birds. They climbed up into the ruins with black on their faces and dust in their hair, and saw the field empty and the ship gone and the ground scarred and broken but quiet. And Corin ran into Leia's arms, said, "I knew you would win." And Thomas sat on the last standing beam of the porch and said, "The farm is gone, but the land is still ours, and the sky is still wide, and as long as we breathe we are not finished." And our Leia looked at him with eyes full of fire and said, "Then let us begin again." The wind moved gently through the broken fence, and the smoke had faded from the sky, and the air smelled like burned wood and fresh soil mixed together like a strange new beginning. And Leia stood barefoot in the field, with Corin resting on her hip and her eyes on the land that had almost been lost, but somehow still stood strong beneath the scars. The house was gone except for the cellar door and a few blackened beams, but the farm was not dead, and the land was not empty, and the spirit of the place still lived in the soil, and in the wind, and in the laughter of a child who had seen fire but not fear, and had walked through ashes without tears. Thomas worked slowly with one hand wrapped in cloth, and one leg still stiff from the burns, but his eyes were bright, and his voice was steady, and each time he lifted a stone, or drove a nail, Leia saw a man not weakened by age or pain, but made stronger by purpose and memory. They started building again, not a house, but a shelter, with thick walls and strong beams, using what they could find, and what they could carry from nearby farms that had been left behind during the years of fear and silence. And sometimes they found tools, or metal sheets, or forgotten seeds, and every small thing felt like a gift from the earth. Corin helped carry sticks and fetch nails, and splash water on the ground when it got too hot, and he laughed every time Thomas called him Little Builder, and Raylia smiled every time Thomas taught him something new about wood or fire or stars, because she knew these were lessons not written in books, but born from truth. One morning, while digging near the old barn, Leia found the broken frame of a mirror, and when she cleaned the dust from the glass she saw herself for the first time in many weeks. And she did not see a cast-out or a fugitive or a mother with nowhere left to run. She saw a woman who had survived and who had grown strong in the fire that night, as they sat near a new fire under a roof made from sheet metal and dreams. Thomas told stories of the stars and the battles he once fought and the people he had met and lost, and Leia listened with her head against the wall and Corin in her lap, and for the first time she did not feel afraid of the future. She asked Thomas if the soldiers would return, and he said maybe, but not soon and not strong, and he showed her the beacon he had pulled from the wreck and said, "I changed the code, and now it tells them this place is dead, and they will not waste more time on Ghostria." Looked at the beacon, and then at the stars, and said, "Maybe ghosts are the ones who watch over the living." And Thomas smiled and said, "Maybe they are the ones who show us how to stay free." As weeks passed, other wanderers began to arrive, small groups and lone travelers, some human, some not, and all with eyes that held questions and hearts that held wounds. And Thomas welcomed them without names, and Wayla gave them water and bread, and Corin showed them where to find shade. Some stayed, and helped build and plant and fix what could be fixed, and together they formed a small circle of tents and walls and fire pits, and slowly the place became more than a shelter. It became a village with no flag and no gate, and no need for permission to dream. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Leia walked to the edge of the field and looked back at the land that had tried to break her and then tried to save her, and she thought about the day she first arrived, cold and lost, and carrying a child that no one wanted. She thought about the word Thomas had spoken that night at the door, and how it had opened more than just a house, and how it had led to this moment, where her son played in the grass with a wooden sword and a smile, and where her own hands no longer shook with fear but moved with purpose and strength. She turned back toward the fire where Thomas sat with others, telling stories and laughing in a way that made his shoulders light and his face soft, and she walked toward him with slow steps and a steady heart. And when she reached him, he looked up and handed her a bowl of stew and said, "Welcome home." She sat beside him, and Corin ran into Her arms and the stars above them blinked like they were watching, and the fire crackled, and the wind moved through the trees, and no one spoke of the past because it had already been buried, and no one asked about the future because it was being built one stone, one breath, one act of kindness at a time. The farm was no longer just a place where an old man lived alone and waited for silence. It was now a place where hope had taken root, and where the cast out had become the center, and where a child with cursed blood had become the heart of something new, and something worth protecting. And in the soil where the old rifle had been buried, a single flower had begun to bloom.